YouTube. Click. And we're live. It is Thursday, March 4th, 2021, 5:02 p.m. We were momentarily delayed today by the technical gods as well as the overlapping meeting gods, which, require a certain attention. It is the fourth day of Pugilism Week, and we are here to talk marriage. My esteemed co-host, Kate Klonick, who has just vanished, oh, she's back, is stepping out of her role as co-host today and into the red corner, where she will be arguing that the state needs to get out of the business of marriage, sponsoring it, choosing who gets to be married, giving tax breaks. In the blue corner, and who conveniently is wearing blue for purposes of being in the blue corner, is my old friend Brad Wilcox, with whom I was a research assistant once upon a time, when we were Cubs, even before we were Cub reporters. Brad is now an esteemed professor of sociology at the University of Virginia and has spent a career looking at questions related to marriage. Let's just say he is for it. Because
hold on, wait. I have my. Hold on. Can I?
Oh yeah, we have to do the
title card. So this is the title card that I made for us for today. It's a Venn diagram because we are both social scientists, Brad, and right here where we overlap, we both have feelings on marriage.
Yes.
As you can see.
All right. So because Brad has a hard stop at 5:50, we are going to give, and also because he's making the affirmative case, he gets to open the show. Brad, tell us why we should all be married and why the state should be involved.
Ben, thanks for having me on today. Well, first of all, we should not all be married. I wouldn't never say that. But what I would say is that, for most adults, marriage is a good thing. And it's also a great thing for kids to have married parents. So the state has kind of an interest in promoting marriage as kind of the best vehicle, the best place, the best institution particularly for the bearing and rearing of children. So that's sort of, I think, that why the state is concerned about this, rather than being, the state doesn't care who, Ben, you play. I think do martial arts, Ben?
I don't these days because I can't breathe on people, but in general, yes.
So the state doesn't really care who your partner is when it comes to martial arts, but the state has kind of more of an interest when it comes to sort of your role as a parent, a partner, and a member of a family in that sense. That's sort of the big picture, I think, point that I would make to begin with. And we can certainly talk about, many ways in which both adults and kids today are more likely to flourish, inside marriage than outside marriage. We know, for instance, that when it comes to adults, that there's about a 60% reduction in your risk of being poor. That's net of things like race and education and age for men and women today who are married compared to those who are not. We know also, particularly actually in the last year, there's a big gap when it comes to happiness for adults between those who are married and those who are not married. That gap rose from about 32% in 2019 to 52% in the COVID year in 2020. But then
that 32% of people were happier?
Yeah, Gallup found,
or unhappy?
Gallup found in 2019 that married people were about 32% more likely to say that they had excellent mental health, and compared to those who were not married. And that rose to kind of a 52% increase in 2020 in terms of your odds of being in excellent mental health if you were married compared to those who were not married. So these are the kinds of things we see with adults. With kids, we see, for instance, that kids who are raised in married homes are about 2 times more likely to graduate from college. They're about half as likely to land in prison or in jail by the time they're in their 30s, and they're about 60% more likely to move into the middle class or higher. And again, this is kind of controlling for things like their education, their race, and the like. It's also worth noting, just on the final point here in terms of the research, that Raj Chetty finds that the most powerful predictor of poor kids realizing the American dream, kind of measured at the neighborhood level, is the share of two-parent families in a neighborhood. So this is kind of just one more example of the way in which there's a strong connection between healthy families and sort of the health of the American dream here in the US. So those are kind of just a few stats to kind of get us thinking about this conversation.
All right, so I forgot to ask people to fill out the pre-debate poll. So please do so as though you had not just heard Brad already start the debate. Kate, give us the overview of the case against state-backed marriage. And what exactly do you mean by being up, like?
So I have no problem with religious marriage. I have no problem with ceremonies. I have no problem with two people holding hands on the beach and saying to each other, like, just by themselves, like, we're going to be together forever. I have no problem with any type of religious ceremony. My problem is when the state basically pivots or conditions certain benefits on marriage, which it does through taxes, which it does through various types of through intestate law and a number of other things. And so there's a huge matter of kind of wealth distribution that changes around marriage. And I think that that's problematic because the people that get married in the first instance are wealthier and more educated and older than the rest of the population. And so I think that a lot of the studies, and so I want to accept Brad's premise, though. I want to accept that the reason that the state is ostensibly in the business of marriage is actually a noble one, that they want to help kids and that they think that having marriage helps kids. But I don't think that the empirics bear that out at all. And I think, in fact, that the condition and the state of state-sanctioned marriage actually ends up hurting and contributes to some of the problems that actually happen when marriages break up and the stigmas that get created and the harm that happens when marriages inevitably end or marriages don't end, and we'll get to that later, on the psyche of kids. And so one of the things that I'm going to base it, the main argument that I basically have with most probably of the studies that Brad's going to cite to is very much that they have the third variable problem. You can look at a city, right? And you can look at a city and all of a sudden there is an increase in air conditioning units. And there's also an increase in drownings. And you're like, oh my gosh, maybe the air conditioning units going up has some type of like correlation with like drownings or some type of implication, or maybe there's a causation there. But no, it just turns out that actually there's a third variable. It turns out that during that particular month that you're looking at those statistics, it was very hot and more people went swimming. And so I think that there is something similar with marriage. It's a little bit different. It is more like if I was going to look at a class of people, average people, and say how good a ball player you're going to be. And then I was going to kind of sample the Yankees and be like, how good a ball player are you going to be? And then say, well, it seems to me that the reason that you're a good ball player is because you put on a Yankee uniform. And that's just not, to me, the actual underlying part of what makes you a good ball player.
So wait, Kate, what's the third variable here?
The third variable in that scenario would be the uniform,
No. The third variable in the marriage scenario. What is the third variable that is causing, assuming Brad's data are correct, that's causing all of these people to A, be married, and B, be happier?
It's a little bit the inverse, which is that basically I think that the idea is that there is a sample group of stable, that is already stable, well educated, and tends to also be married, and that sample group that stability basically lets kids be happier and lets people have happier lives, and that marriage has nothing to do with it. It correlates with it, but it's not a causative factor at all. And that in fact wealth and equality and race and opportunity have a lot to do with it. And so that I basically think that that because you already have a population that's more cut out that is going to be more likely to get married, if that's who you're sampling, you're going to get something that says marriage is the reason this is happening. But I don't think that there's a causative link there.
Okay, so Brad, let's
Yeah,
let's go with that. To what
sure.
extent do you have cause and effect backwards? And how do we know that marriage is causing greater stability and greater happiness both in adults and children, rather than believing that people who are have more stability, have more happiness, are more likely to get married?
Yeah, no, great questions, great points. I mean, I would say, first of all, it's important to recognize and acknowledge that some outcomes, like for instance, education, it looks like money, just to go to her point about sort of wealth and affluence, is actually a better predictor of kids' educational attainment, including college. So, there she could make that point. But it's important to note that on other outcomes, for instance, incarceration, even kind of kids' odds of realizing the American dream, later in life, at least in a multivariate model where you're controlling for family income, controlling for race, controlling for, parents' education, you do find that family structure is a better predictor for kids of their odds of landing in jail or of getting into the middle class or higher as adults than is how much money their parents had. So I think that's interesting. But in terms of kind of more rigorous, say, econometric or psychological models, we also see, for instance, the work of John Gruber, no obvious conservative there, who found in his work on the introduction of no-fault divorce in states across the U.S. in the 70s, that, quote, adults who were exposed to unilateral divorce regulations as children are less well-educated, have lower family incomes, they're more likely to separate, in their own adult relationships, and have higher odds of adult suicide. We also see twin studies on this question as well. We find that men, for instance, who are married tend to earn more compared to their identical twins who are not married. And we see too from twin studies that kids whose typically they're comparing the moms who are twins and looking at their kids and sort of seeing among the moms who get married and then divorced, how do their kids do compared to their sisters who get married and do not get divorced, and finding a lot of emotional and social outcomes using those twin studies that their kids do better when the parents don't get divorced. So I think we could kind of debate about the science, but I want to just add also that there's sort of a bigger point, or there's kind of a theoretical point to make to Kate, and that is that marriage, as a sociologist, marriage is an institution. It has there's a ceremony that begins. It could be in the court, it could be in a church, a synagogue, mosque, temple, whatever. But it's a ceremony that people enter into, both where they make a vow before their partner and before their family and friends. And that's just one of the big ways in which marriage differs from both cohabitation and dating. And so I think that's one reason theoretically why marriage is a much more stable institution than is cohabitation, of course, than is dating. And that's true not just in the US, it's true also in countries like Sweden and France and the United Kingdom and Norway. So this is not just kind of an American thing. This is more of a general, I would say, human thing, that this institution has served the purpose of engendering stability in family life in many different societies and many different civilizations across time and space.
Okay. So I think that that's a wonderful point. And I think that you're right. I actually love weddings for that. I love weddings for the community aspect and the fact that you allow your entire support network to come around and support your relationship. But that doesn't have anything to do with the state sanctioned part of it, right? Which is really what I'm getting to, and so I think that your theoretical point is correct. I think that that having the support of a community in your relationship is really important and makes it more likely to survive, certainly. And making that kind of promise to yourselves. But that's not what having a state state-sanctioned marriage does. What a state-sanctioned marriage does was create a lot of friction and difficulty in parting from your significant other. And that basically means that you have to pay a lot of money for a divorce, or you can have an amicable divorce. It does absolutely happen. Pay a lot of money for a divorce. It's very costly. It's like as one friend once told me, I didn't know when I was getting married that I was signing a financial suicide pact. And that was like literally how they felt about kind of like and getting out of a very abusive relationship that they probably should have gotten out of 5 years beforehand, but they had gotten married and they felt they didn't have kids and they felt like they should stay in the marriage and try to make it work. And I just think that there's something interesting there. The other thing that's really interesting about this is I want to know what your feelings are on marriage if there aren't any children involved. Like, what if there aren't any children? Do you care whether people cohabitate or not? Where does the interest is the interest only in two people being together for the sake of for children?
Yeah, so I think to respond to your questions or your points, I think it's important to sort of see how kind of I think about this in terms of we're trying to kind of give our society a kind of, a gold standard of commitment, if you will, that's accessible to people. And so one of the benefits of having legal marriage is it kind of gives this kind of publicly accessible institution to everybody. And so that's, something that kind of everyone kind of can aspire to, this way of signaling their commitment to their partner and to their family and friends. And then in terms of the friction, in terms of getting out of marriage, well, that's actually, I think, part of the benefit of marriage. There's a certain recognition going into it that you're trying to make a commitment that's of a higher character than when you just live with someone. And so we have a free society here. Obviously, people don't have to marry. They're not required to marry. They can date. They can live apart, they can cohabit. But we have created, obviously an option for people who are desiring to sort of solidify their commitment to enter into marriage, which has obviously both a cultural and a legal character in our society. And I'm just sort of saying that's a good thing, because we know that on average, people who just cohabit with and without kids are just much more likely to break up. Even when you control for different factors like their education and their income. So I'm all for having kind of a higher, bar of commitment that people can kind of jump over. It signals both to themselves, to their partner, and to any kids that they might have, that they have this commitment, this high level of commitment to one another.
Okay, so I want to push you both. It seems to me you guys actually aren't arguing about the institution of marriage as a cultural thing. You're not arguing about whether people should or should not get married. You're arguing about what the state's role in the enterprise should be.
Yes, but I'm also arguing that I think that Brad is arguing that there is more of a one-to-one between that there are more benefits to marriage than there are without it, and I'm saying there's absolutely no benefits to marriage there aren't without it.
Right, but as I understand your case, it doesn't really depend on that, right? Because you could say, you don't happen to believe this, but you could say, oh, I'll grant you all the happiness data, all the stability, I'll grant you all the social science. I just don't see what the state's role is in encouraging that. It may be that you can have all kinds of civil society institutions, churches, religious groups that support that, and you may be right that it's better if a whole lot of people choose to get married, but it would be better if a whole lot of people choose not to smoke too.
Well,
and that doesn't mean that cigarettes should be illegal. So I want to focus, we can come back to the social science dimension, but I want to focus on push you both on what your vision of the state role in marriage is. And so, Brad, let me start with you. I'm going to be intentionally a little bit outrageous with both of you, because I think to get to the point here that's actually separating, you have to look at some edge cases. So my question, Brad, is why so let's assume that you're right on all the social science, and that it's really better if people get married than if they don't. What 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 mechanisms of encouragement to get married uh, are and aren't off limits to you? I mean, how coercive should the state be allowed to be financially, or you might call it incentives, but like what would be too much for the state to do to say, hey, on average, people will be a lot happier if they get married. So let's, not just give people tax incentives to do it, but fine people who don't, like sort of like a kind of marriage mandate, like the Obamacare healthcare mandate. What are you and aren't you, like, if the state's going to be involved, how involved can it be?
Yeah, great. Good question. I think it's important to begin, though, by noting that we have a huge marriage divide in this country right now. And Kate was actually kind of alluding to this earlier in her comments. But today, what we see is that Americans who've got a college degree and more income, as well as Americans who are more religious, actually tend to be much more likely to both marry now in the first place and to stay married in the second place. And of course, it wasn't always like this. So back 60 years ago, 80 years ago, there was no big class divide in marriage. There's no big racial divide in marriage as well, actually. And so I'm actually trying to work to a world where there isn't anymore a class divide in marriage, where there isn't actually a racial divide in marriage. And so it's a more egalitarian institution in that sense, where people have sort of broad access to marriage. So that's sort of my intention here. And to kind of get to that place, among other things, I would do two things. I would have our public institutions, including our public schools, do a better job of communicating the benefits of marriage to kids, so that they have a better sense of sort of how this can benefit both them and any kids that they have down the road. And the second thing that I would do is to really try to eliminate a lot of the marriage penalties that are facing working class Americans in our means tested policies today. So, I think it is the case that there are some couples, middle class couples and affluent couples, who have benefits from the federal government in terms of their taxes, for instance. But there are many couples, particularly working class couples, who actually end up losing money today, or losing access, for instance, to Medicaid, if they go ahead and tie the knot. And I think that's the kind of thing that we could address by reforming some of our means tested programs. Those are just two ideas I would put up there.
And Brad, just to follow up on that, um, it's very hard in the tax code to make a particular behavior always advantageous.
Sure, of
Um,
course.
and, and um, I don't. I mean, it's actually just technically hard to do. Um, I think it is never disadvantageous for tax purposes to give to charities, but
Sure.
there are limits, right?
Right.
And so the question is, should it be an aspiration, a policy aspiration, for it to always be tax advantageous to be married, or above a certain means tested level, should the state not care?
Well, so what we actually have done, though, Ben, in recent years is we've kind of adjusted the income taxes, not in every single way, and not for people at the really top of the ladder in every way, but we have basically set two different levels for income taxes. And we try to do that to sort of address this marriage penalty issue. So the problem, though, right, is we haven't done this very same thing for our means tested programs to the same extent. So the thresholds have basically been doubled for married couples in terms of income taxes for most policies, but they've not been adjusted in the same way for working class couples. So all I'm asking here on that particular issue is to kind of take the same approach to things like Medicaid and food stamps, so that working class couples. I talked to a couple here in Virginia last year, and they've been together for years, two kids, but they don't have a marriage because if they were to marry, they'd lose access to Medicaid here in the state of Virginia. So this is the kind of, I think, reform we could move forward on.
All right, Kate, I want to push you on the other side of this. The
Okay.
state of Utah, as a condition of of admission to the union, had to ban polygamy.
Hmm.
More recently, there have been prosecutions for people associated with the reform Church of Latter-day Saints,
Mm-hmm.
most famously Warren Jeffs, for uh, plural marriages that seemed, that had serious elements of sex trafficking. Now, some of them involved underage people. Let's leave that aside. But was the condition of the state, mission of the state of Utah, that condition associated with it wrong? Does the state have an interest in, say, prosecuting people like Warren Jeffs who are keeping a harem around them, or should we have a very libertarian attitude toward that, that says, hey, let's assume they're all adults, which in Warren Jeffs' case I think they were not, but assuming they're all adults, they're all consenting, that's a matter of religious free exercise, and the state's interest in marriage actually doesn't, when you say the state has should have no involvement here, if Warren Jeffs wants to surround himself with 18-year-olds whom he calls his wives, is that a problem?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not quite understanding why me saying there shouldn't be any type of marriage is like is means that there's some type of support for a polygamy type of situation. In fact, I would say that would just like be some type of, if that is something that the state decides on its own that it wants to go after, it can pass some type of criminal statute or some type of statute to attack, right?
No, no, but hang on a second, because if there's no state definition of marriage, if the state is not the licensing agency for the first marriage, then
But like, why?
like, to go back to your
So
first
let's assume that
your
they all
first
are
example,
adults,
where
which I
people are standing on the beach pledging themselves to it. Why does the state have, if it has no interest in the first standing on the beach couple, why does it have an interest in the 12th?
I see what you're saying, but I don't think that is like a very serious rebuttal, just in terms of like a scale
It's just a
and
question. It's not a rebuttal. I'm just trying to
no.
explore the
What
edges.
do I think? I guess that I think that yes, like that adults are consenting and they can agree to be in those types of relationships with each other, and that the state couldn't do anything about it if they got out of the business of marriage. Sure. Like absolutely, that is a fine outcome for me, as long as it doesn't involve like minors or some type of other like or some type of other activity. I guess for me, I don't, again, I really want to drive home that like I think that like, and I think this is like a problem when two people on very different sides of an ideological spectrum debate each other. I agree with like I with a lot of what Brad is saying and the outcome, but I just don't agree quite with how he's getting there. Like I don't think, like, I want kids to grow up in stable families. I just don't think that is necessarily hinged on promoting marriage. And in fact, I think that maybe promoting marriage ends up being part of the problem. And so I think that in fact, like if you promoted other types of things that bring stability to kids' lives, or other types of programs that like allowed people to have stable family structures, that those would be more effective directly than marriage. So for example, we talked before about like there's the vast majority of kind of unwed single parents or unwed cohabitating parents are like they are not, who are not married, are in living in poverty and like have all of these other issues. And I think that there is something to be said for the fact that you could attack that problem by creating some type of help with childcare. It's just easier to have two parents, any parents, like any number of parents, and more than one, and that there's a lot of things that like marriage doesn't necessarily get us to, that I just think that like, but the I guess, I'm sorry, Ben, I just don't think the polygamy question is like interesting. Like I just don't like, it just seems like such a red, it just seems like an, oh my God, like there could be polygamy in like a few places, like if the state got out of the business of marriage. But I just think about all of the women who get married to people they don't, or to people they don't care about, and are stuck in really hard to get out of domestic situations where they're being abused, and they can't leave because they're married, and they don't feel like they can. It's like the difficulty of getting a divorce is very high, or something like that. And I just think that those seem much more prevalent to me than weren't like a bunch of like 20 something women pledge themselves to a 70-year-old man because they're part of a cult. It doesn't seem to be like the same. It just seems apples to oranges.
All right. So, Brad, before we go to audience questions, and I am bringing them in now, we have an incredible number of really interesting questions. So I'm going to let the audience take over. I want to push you on something that has come up several times in the chat, which Kate also just alluded to, which is marriage better for people, or is marriage better for men? There's there's a lot of data.
I was like alluding it to a little bit, but like I wasn't even going to go there, honestly.
No,
but a very different question.
But I have seen a fair amount of data, for example, that married men live longer than non-married men. And I have not seen data that married women live longer than unmarried women. I'm just curious.
No, but the unmarried women are happier, according to many surveys. No, I'm just kidding.
How gender balanced is the happiness data here, the outcomes data?
Yeah, so Ben, I think in general, marriage is more valuable for men than women, but on average, women benefit from women benefit from marriage as well. It's also important here, though, to bring in the kids once again, and there's no question that girls who are being raised in stably married households do better in school. They do a lot better emotionally. They do better economically long term compared to their female peers who are being raised in unstable homes. So we have to kind of, I think, keep the whole picture in mind here. And of course, also recognize too, in line with Raj Chetty's data, that women who are living in communities with more two-parent families are, more likely to be safer. They're less likely to experience child poverty in their communities, et cetera. So there's a number of ways in which marriage affects women and affects girls that we have to think about when we answer that question. But yes, in terms of just comparing the average man, the average woman, I think it is fair to say that men benefit a bit more from marriage than do women.
All right. Let us go to audience questions, and
I also just want to point out, just to kind of like to is an excellent article that I discovered kind of prepping for this today, why Richard Reeves at Brookings, saying cohabiting parents differ from married ones in 3 big ways. And he goes through, I don't know if you've read this before, I just dropped it in the chat, Brad, but I really liked it, and it ended up actually kind of making a little bit my point, which is basically stable families, whatever you call them, are the ones that are better. And so why don't we promote the stability, the economic stability, like contraception, so that they can decide when to plan a baby, to education reform. Like those things seem like I know that they're less direct, and you think that there's some type of magic ticket with like the marriage thing. I just don't think that there is.
Yeah, the issue though, right, is that, as I said before, even in places like Sweden and Norway and France and the United Kingdom, we still find in these very different, national contexts, less religious contexts, places where there's more welfare, that marriage is more stable than cohabitation. And actually, I also had a piece in Brookings, which I'm posting now, about that. So the point I'm making is that sort of there's a stability premium that we find in marriage across many different cultural contexts. And that's in part, I think, because the terms of entry are quite different than the terms of entry for cohabitation. And so that's part of, I think, our difference here, Kate.
So we are going to go to audience questions. With each question, I'm going to ask the questioner to direct the question to a particular side. You can identify it by name or color. The Reverend Dr. Hillary Livingston, the floor is yours for the first question.
Thank you. Interesting discussion. We've talked a lot about marriage, but as a single woman myself, I'm wondering, I guess I'm directing this question to Brad. how do you view single people, particularly women who either by choice or circumstance don't get married, don't have kids? And is there a way to support marriage without stigmatizing single people?
Great question.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, I was raised by a single mom, and I certainly think that we need to have obviously an appreciation for single parents and single people. And so I'm kind of more about the idea of just trying to kind of give people a picture of the way in which marriage is a good thing for, for most of us, but to understand and appreciate that there are exceptions. And particularly when you're thinking about people who have had obviously a violent relationship or some other kind of toxic relationship, that's the kind of situation where a separation, can be warranted. But certainly, I'm not saying again that everyone should be married. And I think also we need to sort of appreciate too how important it is for communities, including religious ones, perhaps like the one you're involved with, to make a place, for people who are single, because oftentimes people who are single feel like they're excluded in communities, including especially religious communities.
Can I really quickly just say
Please.
something about that, which is this is actually kind of one of the things that really bothers me about the state sanctioned marriage is like that I think that it privileges people that have like the whether you want it to be, whether you think it's a good thing or not, have found somebody else. Like, why the fuck is that like a reason to get a tax break, right? Like, it doesn't matter if you have kids or not, like, or maybe it does, you'll get even more tax breaks with that. But like, it just seems like a massively inequitable function for the government to promote something like that and stigmatize other people that are like living lives that like they just don't want to do this. And to your point, Brad, like about what is created by entering into the contract of marriage, you're absolutely right that there's a barrier to entry and and then there's a barrier to exit. It's a liberty reducing agreement. Like you're kind of,
Right.
you are absolutely like trading off like your liberty to do certain things and to marry someone else and to do whatever. And I think that like the liberty reducing elements of it that are created by the state, which like we all agree everyone should really be able to get out of if things get bad enough, right? Like and then like basically like the way that this ends up basically thwarting an entire universe of people that just doesn't choose to be in these kind of binary relationships. And I think that that's really important.
Yeah, I think, but the point I would make is really a two-word point. It's positive externalities, okay? And so we obviously do give benefits for people owning homes. And there's a whole research literature on the sort of the positive externalities that come from owning your own home. The same idea applies to marriage. We know that kind of the stability engendered by marriage doesn't just matter for you and your partner and any kids that you might have. It matters for your neighborhood, for your schools, for the safety of your larger community. So the point I'm making is that when marriage is healthy, when marriage is strong, we know that our streets are safer, our schools are functioning better. And we also know that opportunity for poor kids, for instance, again, drawing on Raj Chetty's data, is better. So that's the point. And just to kind of dial back quickly on this sort of larger issue here, we have to recognize too that what happens in families really matters for sort of the character of our societies. We see this in a new book by Joseph Heinrich at Harvard. The book is called The Weirdest People in the World, How the West Became Psychologically Peculiar and Particularly Prosperous. But his point in the book, in part, is that our more nucleated approach to family life was really tied to sort of the growth of a certain kind of individualism in the West. And
yes.
other societies, more kinship-based societies, don't have the same appreciation for the individual that the West does. So my point is that if we move away from kind of marriage, we move away from the nuclear family, this is not going to be something that's going to be just a question of like, your taste, Kate, versus my taste. This is going to have, and already actually is having, kind of profound implications for things like, income inequality, the relative, performance of our kids in schools, and many other sort of social and cultural dimensions of our common life. This is a big deal, is what I'm saying.
All right.
No,
Eric
I agree.
Berg.
I mean, that's why I wanted to argue about it with somebody.
Eric Berg, the floor is yours. Sorry to leave you hanging on the screen so long. I try to time bringing people in. Like we call this the Alice Lee rule. We try to bring people in at exactly the moment that they're going to speak. But then, the guests fool us and respond to each other. And so my apologies for leaving your mug on the screen for everybody to gawk at you.
No worries. Question for Kate. So independent of the kind of the debate around children, if it could be shown that there were positive financial externalities for both the individual married couple and the government, would that constitute enough basis for the government to sanction marriage, or would that still not prove the point from your perspective?
Well, I'm just curious really quickly. So when you say that there are positive financial relationships that like the government, like that were not, that were like, that were organically came out of that, of a marriage, came out of marriage organically because of because of marriage, both the government and individual couples benefited, not because of tax breaks or anything like that, just because of like the market working.
Right. So like hypothetically, if you could show that if 20% of, if you had 20% higher marriage rates, it would increase tax revenue to the government and it would increase GDP output, and you would have on average, I'm not saying this data exists, but, and you would have on average higher wealth for the people in marriage. Would that constitute enough evidence to support state-sponsored marriage?
Possibly. I mean, I would also say that I would support state-sponsored marriage if I felt like marriage, like even the case that Brad was making, that there was in fact that one-to-one relationship between marriage and the well-being of children. That would be sufficient for me. I just don't think that, I think that marriage is like, I feel like Brad is arguing to buy everyone Yankees uniforms, and I'm arguing like, let's have people like have programs that make people run laps and get batting practice and like go to the ballpark and see other people play and like do everything else, and then maybe we'll have more superstar athletes and Derek Jeters. Like that's kind of what I'm saying, and like everyone will be happier, and that like I don't think that just putting on the uniform, getting married, like makes all of these other things like fall into place necessarily.
All right. Speaking of Alice Lee, I happen to have her right here. The floor is yours, Alice.
Okay, I'm not entirely sure. I think this is a question for Brad, but redirect it if you want to, Ben.
Well, we can just direct it at the ether. The rule, apply it to one is just a disciplinary device to keep the conversation focused, but if it's implausible, don't do it.
Okay, so my question is, I think marriage has changed a lot in, let's say, the past 70 years. And I'll sum it up as like from a first step into adulthood to kind of a final step into adulthood. And I was wondering if, well, if those two kind of extremes of that cultural change, if you feel strongly or less strongly about your position at either one of them.
It's a really great question. Go ahead, Brad. You probably have more insight into this than me.
Yeah, so it's moved from being kind of a cornerstone for people's adult lives, as Andrew Trulin has said, he's a sociologist, to being a capstone for people's lives. And, you know, I don't want to sort of wimp out on this, but I would actually like to sort of see us move back more towards the middle of the sort of capstone and the cornerstone. So people were getting married in their early 20s back in the day, and now they're getting married closer to 30. And I think both for adults and kids, sort of getting married kind of in your mid 20s would be a sweeter spot for people in terms of being mature enough to make a good decision, but also kind of having enough time to, you know, have the kids that you would like to and establish the common life together that you would like to, et cetera. So, and to speak personally, you know, Ben and I are kind of in the same camp on that in terms of our own personal experience and that approach to establishing a common life together.
Yes, Brad is referring to the fact here that he and I both got married exceptionally young. And
well, how old were you guys when you got married?
I was 24, not too young.
I was 22.
Wait, and so when did you guys start dating your significant others?
Go ahead, Brad.
Yeah, my senior year in college.
Yeah, and the answer to that question in my case is rather complicated. And suffice it to say that it is not a question I choose to answer in public.
Oh, okay. Well, anyways, I will just say that like I started dating my partner when I was 23. Like, and we've been together for 14 years. And
Yeah,
so
but
like,
you would be an example, just as Brad and I are examples of the outlying sort of old school approach to marriage among people in Gen X. You're an example of particularly stable, non-marriage, long-term relationships, right? I
yeah,
mean, but
yeah.
aren't we talking about averages here, not edge cases?
I guess I'm trying to point, well, I guess what I'm trying to point out is that I think it's not averages. It's just that there's like, I think that I can provide, I will, and we will provide at some point a very kind of like stable family for children, and that this is not something that like will have any that marriage will have any nexus in. And maybe I am an edge case, but I just have to think that like there's more people like me than not like me, and that like I have now watched so many friends in the course of 14 years, and John and I were just counting actually last night how many weddings we've gone to, gay weddings, straight weddings, like huge weddings, small weddings, that have ended in divorce, and the ones that have not, and trying to kind of count up. And it was like I think actually more of our friends are together than not. But like there was like a significant number. It was probably close to 50%, probably 40%. And that, some of those lasted 9 months and some of them lasted 10 years and then got divorced. And and so I just think that for me, it just doesn't seem to be an indicator of anything, I guess, is the point.
Yeah, but I guess Kate, in this case, your experience is not representative. So what we've seen is that sort of we reached a kind of a height, for divorce in 1980, and since then it's come down. And we would say probably around 39% of first marriages today end in divorce, but it keeps coming down. Partly because, of course, marriage again is more selective in general today than it was, back in 1975. But it is the case.
And because people wait later.
Well, partly because they wait later, but also because the kinds of people who are getting married today are more selective in terms of, again, being more educated, more affluent, and also more religious. But also, yes, because I think also there's been a sort of a shift culturally. There was a great article actually in the New York Times written by Pamela Paul, sort of talking about how divorce had lost its groove in Park Slope and in Seattle, obviously not hotbeds of conservatism. But I think
that's where I'm sitting right now.
I think for at least some people, there's a recognition today that like kind of keeping things together for your kids is, a lot more important than it was for a lot of folks, obviously in the 1970s.
But Park Slope is famously full of lesbians, so that was, one of the reasons that there was no marriage for a long time.
3 more questions. We're going to get through them all, but I would be remiss if I didn't tell my divorce joke before we did, given what Brad just said. 2 97-year-old people go before a judge and they say they want to get a divorce, and the judge bursts out laughing. And he says, "How long have you been dissatisfied with each other?" And the old man says, "Oh, about 70 years. And he says, "Well, what's the problem?" And the old woman says, he eats his soup with a fork. He makes jokes that aren't funny. And the old man says, "And she doesn't laugh at them." And he says, "Why did you wait till now?" And they say, "Well, we're waiting for the kids to die." Okay, Terry, the floor is yours.
I think this is for Brad. Is there a way to separate out the concepts, the cultural, religious, sacramental version of marriage and the state contract of marriage, and give them 2 different names so that we have 2 different institutions?
One could certainly do that. There is something like that in France. They have civil pacts and they have marriage, but it's still not really necessarily seen even in France as a kind of religious thing versus a secular thing. I mean, I'd prefer just to kind of keep obviously the word marriage for this kind of gold standard, recognizing that this is an institution that we see obviously not just in the US, but not just in Christian contexts, but in China and Egypt and India, et cetera. So I just sort of think about this as kind of a human institution, not as a religious institution. And for that reason, that I like obviously kind of keeping the term marriage for everybody.
Then it doesn't need to be a legal institution?
Oh no, I think having the law kind of, basically set some simple parameters in terms of the terms of entry and the terms of exit is helpful. Again, particularly because oftentimes, kids become involved, in in marriages, and you need to figure out some way if they do break up in terms of how you're going to allocate, child custody, not to mention child support and property division.
Okay, so Brad needs to go, so we are going to let him vanish in a puff of smoke. And this gives Kate the opportunity to land
Brad,
a
now
whole lot
I'm
of
gonna win the debate
unfair
now, Brad.
punches.
Totally.
But the
This is an honor.
post-debate
I was
poll
very
is
nice to
up
talk to
now.
Okay.
So if you can vote now before Kate lands all the unfair punches on Brad's invisible presence.
I don't see it, Ben.
It should be there. Oh, it's hidden. Now it's not. It's there. All right. Brad, you're a great American. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for this completely uncivilized discussion that was full of no holds barred, inappropriate ad hominem attacks. It's great to see your face.
Yeah, likewise, Ben. Thanks, Kate.
Yeah, thanks, Brad.
Stephen Friedman, you're a black square, but the floor is yours.
Actually, that's Hal's eye, by the way. Oh, right now, yes, I'm blocking this. I'm inappropriate.
Yeah, you're
Yep.
like
That was the
the
idea.
eye of Sauron or something.
I don't know which question you wanted me to ask. I know you want me to keep to questions that I've asked. So, which of the many?
I didn't. I only
choice.
saw one. The one that
whether or
caused me
not
to
I
call you
deserve
up
Scotch.
is the religious history one.
Yeah, I mean, these things grow out of religious history. Prior in the Middle East, you had harems, and one of the things that I understand is that the institution of marriage was actually designed to, among other things, reduce the level of violence in these cultures. So I guess from a cognitive psychology point of view, I'm curious about Kate's point of view about the asymmetry of reproduction, why that seems to have led to marriage, and is this a legitimate thing to do in this world in which we no longer have to care about that from a technical point of view?
No, I think that one of the things I didn't really want to get into because I didn't have the time to look up the studies on this, but there's just like a host of data and a host of studies on the fact that like poor Black people don't get married because it's not culturally part of them. They have kids at 15 and 25 and like all of these different ages and don't get married, and that marriage would not solve necessarily any of those problems if someone just threw them together into a marriage. That doesn't mean that a person would be around, or that a person like that a dad would be there, or that that a parent would be there. It is like as Brad said, like a high exit or a high entry and a high exit thing legally, but we have all of those things in law without marriage existing. So for example, you can drop a will and get around intestate law, or recreate intestate law, living wills. You can contract for all of these various types of things with your children and like how everything like descends. There's just no reason for there to be. It just doesn't make sense to me that marriage is this moment that creates stability. I understand that he thinks that you enter into a partnership with another person, it's difficult to get out of, and so you both look at each other and you say, we're going to make it work for the sake of the children and it's going to be stable. But I just don't think that we've ever like that. We don't expect our friends to do that when they're miserable in relationships, even when there's kids involved sometimes. And I don't actually think that gets at the most salient problems that we have with unstable family structures, which is just that a lot of times it's based on money. A lot of times it's based on people working more than one job. A lot of times it's based on poor childcare or educational opportunities. And so I think that there is a huge amount of projection of what marriage is and should be onto the legal entity of marriage, which is actually just like super limited. It doesn't make a dude show up and babysit his own kid, like, or or anything else. It might make him pay for child support, but he can do that without being married. So I just think that there's just very little here.
All right, Mike Godwin, you get the last question, even though you're a goddamn Nazi.
All right. Well, better late than never. So my question, I just want to tell you why I'm asking this question. I had a client whose husband died very abruptly with very aggressive liver cancer. And when I think about what her situation, now they don't have children, but when I think about what her situation would be like in terms of handling the estate, having an income, managing the funeral, if there had not been sort of a default setting about how property was divided for a formal state-sanctioned marriage, she would have been out of luck, and a lot of people would have been really damaged. Now you can say, and this is kind of a very law professor thing to say, Kate, you could say, well, they should have had contracted, turned everything, all their property into a joint tenancy with right of survivorship, right? But that's, but 70% of Americans don't have a will.
Yep.
And so if the idea is to create an industry for estate planners, cool. But I think that when I look at the fact that marriage as an institution does a lot of good, even for people who aren't having children. And here we're really talking about sometimes second and third or later marriages, where they're not really interested in having children to begin with. But it answers a bunch of questions, and
it's a bundled contract.
It is a bunch of contracts, except that it's not. My relationship with other family members is not a contract. It's this thing that's also recognized by the state. But I think the thing that I want to underscore here, or as you say, stomp on it. I want to stomp it, or whatever it is I want to do. Is that when your partner is dying very quickly, maybe in an accident, maybe with an abrupt disease, to say, oh, well, now's your time, to sign the contract and settle the estate. That's a cruelty. That's a cruelty for real people in the real world. And I think that marriage as an institution serves some purposes. I agree with you about the difficulty of getting out of marriages. I think we could do better on that. But what you really want is a more humane way to deal with broken marriages, not an abolition of a state recognized norm that solves not just property problems, but a whole other set of problems as well. That's
all right. Kate,
I'm really interested in the fact that
respond to the Nazi provocation, and then we will wrap up.
I feel like Ben is bored with this conversation.
No, I love this conversation.
I'm like,
and I have not. Have I shown my hand on this conversation?
I mean, I know your hand because you texted it to me last night. But there's but yes, but no, you have not. I will say, okay, so Mike is speaking in particular to kind of intestate law, which is the law that determines what happens to your estate if you die and all of these other things. And Mike is correct. Like, there are all of these indignities, but those happen all the time anyways to unmarried. If you have an unmarried couple that's like suddenly dying, or a girlfriend that suddenly gets diagnosed with cancer, or like all of these things, there's an indignity to it. There's a ton. What are you doing?
I was showing my hand.
Oh.
In response to the Greek chorus request.
Oh. But no, I think that I understand what Mike is saying. I just think that all of those things are actually quite cultural, and all of them would exist without marriage. And the idea that marriage, so here's another interesting little thing that really bothers me about marriage. The existence of marriage means that there is some level, it exists as a commitment or seriousness, right? That undermines other people who are unwilling to get married, but are just as serious, right? So when I talk about John, there was a certain point at 5 or 6 years in, we stopped calling each other boyfriend and girlfriend because we sounded like kids. You don't call him your girlfriend, or you don't call him your boyfriend. You don't call me your girlfriend anymore. We started calling each other partners because we were just well, we're going to be doing this for a while. And it's been a while and we're very happy. And this just seems right for us. And the fact that I had to go and do job interviews and not be married. If he had been like a spouse, like if he had been like if I had needed to get, like if I had the two body problem as they put it in academia of like having a partnership that is like, you know, both looking for jobs, they wouldn't have taken it seriously unless I had married him and basically could say that he was my husband. And I think that that's crazy. Like, why? That's just like I know so many academics that have gone through all of the horror of the two body problem, gotten their spouse a job, and gotten divorced. It doesn't actually signify anything, because the cost of exit is high enough that it keeps kind of people who are in shitty situations. And then it also, like, if the situation gets bad enough and you have resources, you can get out of it. And so this is just like, it's just not fair for poor people. It stigmatizes single people. It stigmatizes people in non-traditional relationships still. And it diminishes other types of relationships by making it seem like it's the adult in the room. Like it is the gold standard of a relationship, when I don't think it necessarily is. And time has not proven it to be so.
All right. We're going to leave it there. Kate Klonick,
an enemy of marriage.
Let's look at enemy of marriage, friend of the show. All right, so let's look at the poll data here.
I'm in a common law state, not a community property state, April.
So I want to say that Brad gained about 4% in the poll. But he started from a massive deficit of basically 2-1.
Well, he might have won.
The remarkable thing about this debate is, to me, how few minds it changed in either direction.
Mm-hmm. By the way, this is every time I have this debate. No one's mind changes.
Yeah.
Every time I have it, no matter what I say.
So, we are going to leave it there. But tomorrow.
By the way, Ben, do you know that they say that they I think I've been to 10 weddings now that recite Obergefell, like Kennedy's section of Obergefell.
You mean the Sweet Mysteries of Life section of?
Yes, in the fucking ceremony. Do you know that's a thing that people do now?
I didn't know reciting Supreme Court decisions.
Oh no!
So here's what I want to. Here's the question, guys, and I think you all should tweet it. What Supreme Court decision would you want read at your wedding?
Please don't say Obergefell.
No, Obergefell is off limits because that's what set up the question. So other Supreme Court opinions, that'd be cool. All right, so
I'm so patient, and I don't get mad about many things, but I do kind of find, I'm like, why does no one see this? I feel like I'm seeing something, and I'm in a fugue state. I can't get anyone else to see past their priors, and I get nothing I say. Sorry.
Hey, dug-in points of view. People know what they think.
I know.
Speaking of people who know what they think, tomorrow we are going to see if John Lovitz shows up to debate time with me. What's that?
Is he
I don't
going to
know.
show up?
We're going to find out.
Are you going to promise me something, Ben? If he shows up, don't spend 10 minutes making jokes about the fact that he got there on time and that you managed to get to there at the
There
same
will
time.
be no jokes about.
Okay.
So tomorrow, John Lovitz's courage will either abandon him or he will show up. There will either be a debate about time or there will not. It will be either way 22 hours and 54 minutes from now. And until then, we don't have fun anymore. But we still can get married until Kate finally drives a stake into the heart of the institution, kills it once and for all. And I just want to say,
it's just I'm the vampire slayer of marriage.
When I say partner, it doesn't mean my spouse, Tamara Kaufman Wittes. It means Kate Klonick, my partner in Lieu of Fun.
Yeah.
Susan Hennessy, David Priest, Quinta Jurecic, my partners in lawfare.
Partners really does get to be a little messy when
It
you're
does
in
sound a
lawyer
little
land.
businessy, Kate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like not the best. I'm not gonna lie. Okay.
You know, it sounds like you sell staplers together. We will see you tomorrow when Pugilism Week continues with a knockout punch to John Lovett.
Okay.
Kate
Bye,
will
Ben.
host.